Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming. We'll get started here in just a couple minutes. We'll let some people trickle in and get started right at 5 or a minute after. All righty, we'll go ahead and get started. For the sake of time, we have until about 6. We've got Margaret hanging with us to share um, a virtual lecture tonight. So we're really excited to have her. Thank you, Margaret, for joining us. We also have Sarah Weber on the call with us, and she is our special projects director and office manager. She'll be handling live streaming this on Facebook. So if you have any connectivity issues, you can head over to Facebook and catch the rest of it there. And we will also be putting this on our YouTube channel tomorrow as well. So if you've missed it tonight or you want to share it with somebody, it'll be available then. My name is Tracy Lowe. I'm the editor of American Archaeology for the Conservancy, and I'll be your host this evening. I'll go ahead and just give you a quick introduction for anybody who doesn't know the Archaeological Conservancy. We preserve archaeological sites on private land across the U.S. We have about 600 sites at the moment since 1980. And our sites represent a broad array of time periods and cultures, and you can catch us on our website at thearchcons.org. For tonight's session, if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll curate your questions throughout Margaret's presentation, and we will come back to those at the end. We'll leave about 15-20 minutes at the end for questions, and so please use that feature if you have anything that you'd like to ask. And just to give you a little bit of background on Margaret, she's in Arizona. She's recently retired archaeologist, and the last 15 years she's been with the U.S. Forest Service. Correct me if I'm wrong, Margaret, but you worked at the Cleveland National Forest and the Kaibab National Forest near the Grand Canyon until 2022. She became the large project archaeologist for the Tonto National Forest in Arizona and retired in early 2025. Now Margaret is serving as the collections director at the Verde Valley Archaeology Center and Museum in Camp Verde, Arizona, and continues her research on Arizona's African American history, which she'll share some of that tonight in our topic as we delve into a period known as the Great Migration, when about 6 million African Americans moved from the rural South during the Jim Crow era, 1916 and 1970, to other areas in the country looking for better economic opportunities. And Margaret will discuss that in the context of Arizona's logging industry in particular. And Margaret, I'll just go ahead and hand it over to you. You look ready to go with your PowerPoint, and you can get us started on the topic.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to present this topic. This is probably one of Arizona's hidden histories. And to be honest with you, I grew up in Southern California, and it wasn't until I came to Arizona to work for the Forest Service that I actually learned about this history. And really, I would not have learned about it had I not asked a couple of simple questions, and that is, were there African Americans in Arizona, and why were they here? And it became quickly obvious that a good chunk of, or a good portion of the population of African Americans that came here historically were due to the timber industry. So I'm going to start out talking a little bit about African American history of the West, something that few people know about. And then we'll get more into the timber industry and why this is so significant to northern Arizona. And of course, you know how it is. You never can advance your slides the way you think you can. All right. Just to give you a quick little background, for those who are not familiar with Western Black history, what I always like to point out, and most of us are familiar with the 1619 Project, and that is when slaves landed on the East Coast in the Dutch colonies. In actuality, people of African descent were already here in North America well in advance, almost 100 years in advance of that. The first people of African descent actually came to North America with the first Spanish. Spain had had a long relationship with Northern and Western Africa long before they landed here on this continent. And they brought with them that relationship, including individuals of African descent, both mixed race and full Africans. They were coming as workers on ships. They were coming as entrepreneurs. They were coming as enslaved people. And so they were part of the colonization of Mexican or Spanish, and then later Mexican colonization of the Western United States prior to the U.S.-Mexican War. So there had been a long history of African descended people here. Primarily, just to give you a little understanding, as I said, they were here literally with Columbus. The early Spanish did used indigenous people as labor, but as the diseases made their way through the United States and significantly decreased the amount of indigenous population, more and more African slaves were actually brought to the U.S. and used in industry here in Mexico or in Spain, which later became Mexico. Spain basically so well in advance, and so of the 1619 people of African descent, of course, were living in most of the communities in North America. Certainly in those communities we know today, as in Los Angeles, as in Albuquerque, as in Tucson, that would have been or left over from the Mexican period. There would have been people of African Americans or people of African descent in those communities. In general, Mexico, after the war between with the Mexican and Spanish Mexican War, sorry, the Mexico chose, as Mexico took over ownership, Mexico actually began over a series of years to eventually eliminate slavery in Mexico. So by 1837, slavery had essentially all been abolished in Mexican territory. So certainly well before America abolished slaves. So after the U.S., after the Mexican-American War occurred and the U.S. started expanding into the West, one of the biggest issues was the determination of whether the new territory would be slaveholding or not. So certainly before California became a state, there were enslaved people that were brought out to California to work in the gold fields of the Sierra Nevadas. And then after California became a state and areas such as New Mexico and Arizona became territories, certainly the West became open to people of color, both enslaved and non-enslaved. People made their way to the western states. Recognize that Arizona and New Mexico were territories until 1912. They were not states. So the determination of whether they be enslaved or free states was not made because for obvious reasons. But we can tell you that there were certainly people who made their way out. Many that we don't know of. We don't know their names. These are just a few names we happen to know about. James P. Beckworth had been born in slavery. He came out west, was a trapper. He apparently married into the Crow Nation, and he helped guide the military and did a variety of different odd experiences out west. And there is actually the Beckworth Pass in Sierra Nevada is actually named for him, as is Beckworth, California. Another piece of Western history that a lot of people do not know is that there were amongst the Mormons who made their way to Utah, there were many Southerners who brought with them their slaves. So there were, in fact, enslaved people in Utah. Right up until the Civil War, people were, no, I wouldn't say a lot of enslaved people, but they certainly were there, and they were bought and sold in Utah. Biddy Mason, the woman here on the left, she actually was an enslaved person who was taken to the state of California. She was able through the court system in California to earn her freedom and became an entrepreneur. She actually helped start the A&E Church in Los Angeles, which still exists. So these are just examples. There's certainly more, but it tells you that although the population of African Americans out west was not anywhere near the Southeast, the African Americans were here. Absolutely here and taking advantage of opportunities, economic opportunities here in the West. Okay, the other big significant aspect of African American history, of course, is the U.S. colored troops, aka the Buffalo Soldiers. They absolutely were here in the West in very large numbers. Here in Arizona, they were here very early in the 1880s, and then left Arizona for a period of time, and then came back to Arizona right about in the early 19 teens, mainly to protect the U.S. interests against the Mexican Revolution. But the U.S. colored troops were throughout the West, and just a general actually throughout the United States, I should say, not just the West. But as a general rule, for those who are not familiar with them, they were a peacetime army or military that was created after the Civil War, mainly out of veterans who had fought during the Civil War. They were sent out west, basically, as I'd like to say, they were big time police. They helped keep the peace, and they also were used to oppress indigenous people, push them onto reservations and keep them onto reservations. And migrants that were making their way out west, they helped to make sure that they were able to do so safely. Here in Arizona, most of the major forts were occupied by the Buffalo Soldiers at one time or another, especially those forts associated with, for instance, the White Mountain Apache Reservation or San Carlos Apache Reservation, as well as later on towards prior in the 19 teens, as I said, those of you may be familiar with places like Fort Huachuca, which is located in Sierra Vista, Arizona, and was established certainly because of the Mexican Revolution, but it was also a major player during World War II. Most of the Buffalo Soldiers who came west, some of them remained here, oftentimes leaving the military and taking jobs and becoming part of many communities. Some of the Buffalo Soldiers who left the military and stayed in Arizona in the near the border, married into Mexican families. And in some cases, they become involved with tribal communities, etc. So they certainly stayed out west. At least some of them did. All right, now to get into the timber industry. As a general rule, Arizona's timber industry was established in the 1880s when the first railroad came through and allowed opportunity for access and systematic exploitation of the timber resources here in northern Arizona. Right about 1882 and that allowed the ability for industry to come in and also for the lumber to leave the area. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where the lumber industry came in, really for the South, which is where we certainly talk about where African Americans associated with lumber industry really starts. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about Arizona, or at least point out to you this difference. One of the things about Arizona is, as I said, there was significant African American presence in the lumber industry, and there's certainly evidence for that. But yet, the mascot for Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff is this very burly white lumberman. And I'm going to talk about why this is kind of significant and towards the end of the talk. So to understand overall the timber industry, the U.S. timber industry actually started out up in the Northeast, certainly Maine, New Hampshire, Boston, those areas. And prior to the Civil War, and more as we began to move west, more and more timber resources began to be exploited. During the Civil War, however, certainly there was a need for timber, and a lot of the northern timber resources were heavily devastated due to the Civil War. And then, so which basically left the northern industry basically floundering after the Civil War. But the South, the economy in the South, however, was also devastated due to the Civil War. But what they had done in the South that they had not had not happened in the North is they hadn't industrialized in the South like they did in the North. So they had, although they were certainly doing things like growing cotton and other types of products such as that, the South had not systematically exploited their lumber resources like the North had. So in fact, so you had all these timber resources available in the South right after the Civil War. So you had, in that case, you had basically Northern companies making their way out of the North into the South and buying up large amounts of the land that had lumber resources and establishing lumber and mill towns. So who is the obvious labor available to occupy these mill towns and be major labor, but of course the newly freed slaves. And that's exactly what happened. So you see this major amount of African Americans who basically get into the timber industry. These towns, they're basically sawmill towns. They're company towns, and very much the concept of company towns, where they control not only the business, but they control housing. They control, all the shopping. They control everything to do with the actual town, and they provide everything for their workers. But this is the South, which means that these towns are in fact segregated. So, although Black people certainly lived in the community, they probably lived in segregated neighborhoods, and each neighborhood would have had their own church. They would have had their own schools, but the actual working in the mills and the planers, that certainly was mixed race. In other words, the Black people were certainly part of the labor field, and they got trained into skills such as running the machinery, certainly felling trees out in the forest. They gained lots of significant skills around timber industry. And so but of course, given the South, they were only allowed to work in certain levels of the timber companies, but the timber companies absolutely employed a lot of Black people. So I happened to come across this particular statistic out of the book Tribe of the Black Ulysses, where they basically say 83,000 Black men were reported to have worked in southern saw and planing mills as of 1910, which is pretty much between 1910 and 1920 is kind of the height of this industry. And basically there are more Black people in that industry than the cotton textile industry and the other industries such as iron and steel. So a significant amount of African Americans were employed in some level or associated some level of the timber industry in the South. So, getting into the discussion about the diaspora, and this is what makes this timber industry diaspora particularly unique. So, by the 1920s, there had been an overextension of the lumber industry. They basically had overcut. They were running out of resources. So companies in the 1920s, starting in the late 1910s into the early 1920s, out of the South, a variety of different companies, we're talking Virginia, Mississippi, Louisiana, began to look for other resources. They recognized that if they were going to survive, they were going to have to leave the South and go to a different location to be able to continue to make a profit. In this one case involving Arizona, it was the Cady Lumber Company. They were located in, of course, Cady, Louisiana. And in the early 1920s, in an effort to basically survive, the company literally closed their doors. They came to northern area, excuse me, they came to northern Arizona, and they purchased an existing mill on the White Mountain Apache Reservation. For those who are not familiar with the White Mountain Apache Reservation, it's located basically north of Tucson, Phoenix, south of Winslow, Holbrook area, basically central Arizona. The White Mountain Apache Reservation was under the control of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Bureau of Indian Affairs had been trying to sell the lumber resources on the reservation, as well as associated with the national forest. So the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest is also surrounds the White Mountain Apache Reservation. They had succeeded in selling some of the lumber and enticing investment in a mill. At the time, the town was called Coolidge, but the mill did not survive. The investors basically closed up shop and left. And so the Cady Company in the early 20s reached out to the owners and basically purchased the existing mill. They literally closed their doors. Within a week, they closed their doors in Cady, Louisiana, packed up their employees, all 500 or so of them, including all their Black employees, rented a train, made their way to Arizona, and within a week, they were open in a new location. And they had brought with them their African-American employees. Like all migrant stories, that was the start of this consistent or continuous migration of African Americans out of the South to the lumber industries of the West. Primarily, we're talking Arizona, but also the Sierra Nevadas and Oregon. So here in Arizona, they landed in Coolidge. They renamed it McNary. They basically recreated a town that looked just like what they left. So it was a segregated community. I would like to point out before I move on to the next slide, this map here, this migration map, certainly it says 1915, 1920s, and what makes this unique, if you notice the arrows in those maps actually point towards Phoenix for Arizona, when in fact, it really a good chunk of the early migration was to the northern part of the state and the timber industry. Certainly when, families made their way here to McNary, they certainly would have told their family members, they would have written letters home, they would have told their friends about opportunities here, and that alone would have been the impetus for people to come to this area. Basically to hold on. So real quickly, which really demonstrates this change in this population here in Arizona, is this census. You can definitely see the change going, especially you can certainly see that jump between 1920 and 1930, and that part of that has to do with the Buffalo Soldiers, who were brought back basically to defend the border. There was so few African Americans in Arizona that their being here would have impacted the population. However, when you can definitely see that between the 1930s and the 1940s and 1950s, certainly right after the World War II, there's a major jump in the population here in Arizona, and that is due to that movement of people out of the South into Arizona to partake in the timber industry. Now, I should mention that there were already Black people here in participating in the timber industry prior to this diaspora. Companies such as the Reardon's owners and Ayers Company, lumber mills here in Flagstaff, they did have Black employees, and not in large numbers, but they certainly did have Black employees as early as in the 1880s. The Saginaw Manistee Company, who was here in Williams, where I live, they did not hire Black people. They were out of the Midwest, and they were mainly Scandinavian, Danish descended people who, for some reason, felt that, at least according to letters they wrote in the local newspaper, felt that African Americans could not handle the work. Although there were definitely Black people here in Williams at that time, they were not necessarily working in the lumber industry, at least as early as the 1930s. But other lumber companies did. The difference, however, is when the Cady Company comes here to Arizona, that's when that diaspora absolutely starts kicking off. That's where you see this movement of significant amount of lumber workers out of the South to Arizona. So they initially landed in McNary, but they continue to move on to Flagstaff, to Winslow, to Holbrook. By the way, these are all towns along the Route 66 corridor, as well as here in Williams. When I moved here in 2007, I joked that the census said there were basically 2% Black people here in Williams, and I joked that it was 2.5% when I arrived. But what is hidden here in Williams is the fact that there is actually a Black Baptist church here in Williams. There's two in Flagstaff. There's an active one in Holbrook. There's an active one in Winslow. There's an active Black Baptist church in Pine Top, Arizona, and there are still populations there. But these are descendant folks from this diaspora. One of the advantage of these folks moving out of the South to the West is they were paid better. It was a better paying job. And the difference in the diaspora out of the South to the West in the timber industry versus out of the South to the North and the manufacturers in the North is that these folks coming out of the South are highly skilled. They're highly skilled lumber workers. They are coming out of an industry in the South into the same industry in Arizona, the Sierra Nevadas, and Oregon. So they bring these skills, and their skills are known, and this is skills that they continue to apply here in other timber industry markets. So this is an example. This is actually, I just found this photo recently. This is a flyby of McNary. It's much bigger than what is shown in this photo. McNary, just to explain how it was laid out, McNary was laid out into essentially three neighborhoods which surrounded the mill and the planing the plane or box company. So what you are seeing there is you are seeing mainly the combination of the works, the mill and the planing area, with the pond that they would have floated the logs on. But those houses you're seeing up towards the top of the photo, that is the Black population of McNary. Actually, it's a combination of the to the north is actually where the Hispanic, they call it the Hispanic quarters, versus the Black area where the Black people live. They all had company housing that they lived in. There was a hotel, there was a social area such as a bar, restaurant, There was a school. Now in Arizona, the schools were segregated as early as 1909 until 1954. But the way they segregate in Arizona is that they only segregated the elementary schools. High schools were not segregated in Arizona. So the elementary schools, they had elementary schools located in these individual communities. And then when the students were old enough to go to high school, they had to walk to the other part of the community, which essentially is the white part of the community where all the managers lived. The white part of the community is today what is known as McNairy. What you are seeing here in this photo is all gone. It is, and the mill shut down in the 80s, and the tribe chose not to renew the permit. And almost all the material here was either burned down or left. So if you look in Google Earth, for instance, and look at aerials today, you can absolutely see that pond. It's still there, but you will not see buildings in these locations because they are all now gone. So the other part of this, of course, is the logging camps. And I'm an archaeologist, so which means I love trash. I love things to do with trash. And certainly as part of the logging industry is not only the mills and the communities that support the mills and the box companies, but also you have to extract the lumber from the forest. And this is especially where you had a lot of black men who are very skilled and got paid pretty well for their skills to be able to do this. And to do it, they would actually set up a variety of different logging camps that were out near the resources that they're logging. So these logging camps in the forest would have had both white and black people living in them. Some of the camps were a little more permanent. They were jumping off places to other operation activities. One of them on the White Mountain Apache Reservation was called Maverick. The Apache Railroad, which was what was used to bring the logs into McNairy, went to and was extended out to the community of Maverick. It certainly was a mixed race community, still segregated in terms of people had separated housing, and for periods of time there, when the population was large enough, they actually had a separate black school for the black students out there. But so, so not only are the logging towns themselves include black people, but also the logging camps out in amongst the forests and in the forest, out in the area themselves would have had black people associated with them. Okay, so really migration is always an interesting thing, and why do people not migrate? And certainly for the timber industry is no different than anybody else leaving the South. Part of this is a way of escaping violence, which is the same reason why so many people went north. The people who came to the timber industries out west certainly did so because for similar reasons. I would hazard to say, however, that I think some of the black people who lived in the lumber towns in the South were probably a little more protected to some degree from this type of violence simply because they were within these company towns. Not saying that they didn't experience the violence in the company towns, but my guess is that they're less likely to have been a random attacks. There may have been a level of protection. But certainly in the South, these lumber folks, despite their skills, they were not getting paid as well in the South as they were in the North, which is another reason to leave. My understanding is that a man doing the same job in the South got paid got paid as much a day here in Arizona as they did a week in Louisiana for the same job. So that was another motivation, certainly for leaving and picking up and moving up to other timber industries. Also, the industry was in fact fairly transitory. Folks, we have this thing in Arizona. I know people don't know this, but we have this thing in Arizona called snow, which makes removing trees and being able to be effective and out and doing logging out in the forest a little difficult during certain parts of the year. So some folks may have left and gone to other markets where there may have been jobs available and may have set up a seasonal type of situation, which would not have been all that uncommon for labor folks to do that and take advantage of other markets and other job opportunities. And there's certainly evidence of people leaving McNairy and heading up towards the Sierra Nevadas. I was interviewing a gentleman who grew up in McNairy. His family he came there from Mississippi. His family had, his father had sisters who lived in Oregon. So when apparently there was this major movement of folks out of McNairy to Oregon due to family members and other opportunities in Portland, Oregon. So there was these movements out of here into other markets, certainly. So as I already said, I already mentioned that there were other companies that left the South and moved to other areas, certainly the Sierra Nevadas, in California, as well as Oregon. And it's interesting, I didn't know this until I started doing this research, that some of these companies predate McNairy. Some of them left even as early as the 1920s or 1920, late 19 teens. Some came a little later than the Cady company in McNairy, but there certainly was this movement. I don't think it's very well understood how many companies left, how much information, many of these companies are now gone. So there's very little knowledge as to how many people actually made their way to these places and how large their Black populations were at the time that they were in operation. Certainly more room for more research, but I think it's much more prevalent than we know about today. So example here in Maxville, Oregon, and some of you may be aware of is when Oregon was first created as a state, it was essentially created as a white-only state. So for the most part, they certainly did not encourage people of color to move to Oregon, but there was a need for this skilled lumber. So Maxville was one of the few places where they did see the skilled lumbermen coming into Oregon to live and work in those industries. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the preservation and why this history is significant, but also part of the reason why people don't know that it's here. Much less that there are archaeological remains and other things out there that actually represent this history. But for whatever reason is basically being blurred. And part of this is that very few people, especially people who live here in northern Arizona now, which we've seen a lot of movement to Arizona, both northern and southern Arizona from places like California, a lot of new industry coming here, a lot of new people moving into these markets. They have no idea about the previous history of Arizona, and that's including Black people who are moving to Arizona. They're coming in from places like the South and the North, retiring or coming in with new industries. Then they know nothing or very little about the previous Black people who lived in Arizona, or that there in fact is a historic Black Arizona. So people who are coming here don't know that this exists or it exists. As I already mentioned, there are small populations still here in Arizona. They've been here for several generations, but they are small and they live their lives. And so newer people are coming in may not realize that they're here. But as I pointed out, Louis the Lumberjack for NAU, not intentionally, but he certainly does not represent what would have been a significant Black history, a significant amount of Black people who would have been here during the height of the timber industry. Instead, when students come, and including Black students come to NAU, they don't know that, in fact, this industry had significant Black representation. There's nothing to indicate that, and certainly not Louis. And yes, it's a topic of conversation on NAU. There's been a lot of discussion about this, as should be. But certainly that's part that therein lies part of the problem is we've had this influx of new people here who don't know that this history existed. And those who do live here, or oftentimes because of lack of economic opportunities, a lot of people who were here left for other markets. And those history keepers, those knowledge keepers left the area and took that knowledge with them. The other piece of this is for those who are historic preservationists and certainly are familiar with the National Register of Historic Places. There is very few properties that associate with African Americans in the West that are actually on the National Register of Historic Places. And part of that has to do with just a lack of knowledge about Western Black history as a whole. Much less that there's this connection, a significant connection to Black history and the timber industry. So for the most part, for those who check these things, at least certainly about 3% of the properties that are listed on the National Register have to do with African Americans as a whole, even fewer than of African Americans in the West. I'm proud to say that Arizona just recently listed a community of Randolph, which was a Black community associated with the cotton industry. Yes, there was a cotton industry in southern Arizona. And these were folks who were brought in specifically to pick cotton, and that community's here, and that actually just recently got listed on the National Register. It's one of the only very more recent lumber or labor communities to be on the National Register. But this is the exception, not the rule. The other issue I'm finding, especially around this history, is even those who know the history don't recognize it as having significance. They themselves do not understand the role of their and their part of this lumber industry outside of their role here in Arizona. They don't see it how it's connected to the larger issue of the lumber industry of the U.S., certainly a part of the larger issue, the diaspora out of the South to Arizona. By the time most of the folks that are still here, they've been here for a few generations, and they certainly know where their family members migrated from, but they don't necessarily aware of their role from where they were. So they may know that their uncle came here to Flagstaff from Mississippi and encouraged his family members to come in as well later on, but they may not understand what he did or who he worked for while he was in Mississippi. So there's just a general lack of knowledge around that, much less that information is significant and has historic significance in these communities. Also, as most people know, when it comes to African American history, there's a lot of aspects of this history that is difficult and painful. So for some folks, they just simply don't want to revisit it. So I'm going to wrap it up a little bit more here. And the other issue, especially here in northern Arizona, and including with the Forest Service, which is the outfit I used to work for, the forests themselves, for instance, the Coconino National Forest, which is around Flagstaff, I work for the Kaibab, as well as the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest. Those forests are recognizing and seeing archaeologically the remnants of these logging camps, for instance, that we discussed earlier. They are seeing remnants of these places out on the forest. Most of the archaeologists who work for agencies like the Forest Service are trained in Native American or indigenous archaeology, not historic archaeology. Also, majority of these archaeologists, like myself, who work for these agencies aren't from here. They don't have a history here. They don't know that there, in fact, is Black history associated with these sites on these forests. So you have a combination of archaeologists who certainly can tell you that there's a great can or types of cans on these camps and the fact that there's lumber associated, but they're not taking the time to find out if the people who occupied those camps actually were African Americans. And we do know that we have oral histories to say that some of the people who came to northern Arizona ended up in these lumber camps first before coming to communities like Winslow, Holbrook, Pine Top, McNary. So we do know that there were Black camps, but the work has not been done to identify which lumber camps had Black people in them. So that's part of what is blurring this history. The people who are recording these places don't know to ask, were there Black people associated with those places, because they simply don't know this history and really don't have, are not required to learn it. So those are some of the struggles, certainly with trying to identify this history, but also really to use it from an archaeological standpoint as a way to learn more about African American life and culture as it manifested itself here in Arizona and as part of the timber industry. But I can tell you, especially this photo here, this is a mural that was just installed in Flagstaff, Arizona, within the last 2 years. There certainly is a recognition of the importance of this history. Certainly is beginning to come to light. Part of that has to do with more and more people are beginning to recognize that this hidden history here in northern Arizona. Also, the people who are still part of these communities, and in Flagstaff, it's the South Side community associated with the Murdoch Community Center. The Murdoch was actually named after Cleo Murdoch, who was the principal of the Black school that was located at that location, the segregated school. More and more people are beginning to recognize the importance of this history and beginning to find ways to start to preserve it. And so this mural is certainly is a step in the right place, where they're taking photos of historic photos, but also combining it with photos of family members who are still here. For instance, like Coral Evans, who is in that photo, if you can see, she actually was mayor of Flagstaff a couple of years ago. She actually now is a representative with Senator Kelly's office, but she still lives in the home that her grandfather built when she moved to Flagstaff, when they moved to Flagstaff. So the legacy is here if you know where to look. But the key is you need to know where to look, and you need to know to ask the question. All right. I think that's basically the end of my discussion and talk. By the way, this photo, I just love this photo. This is a group of tourists in the Grand Canyon in 1954 or 56. This was taken by the Cole brothers in 1956. Yes, the national parks, which were under the Fred Harvey contract, they did not segregate in the West. So Black people were actually tourists and were able to tour national parks even before the Civil Rights Act, which was not the case in southern states. So I that's why I really love to show this photo for those who want to know the history of that. Anyway, so are there questions?
We have one person on that topic actually asking about the Buffalo Soldiers' role in being the unofficial first park rangers in
Oh,
Yosemite, and I know they were at Sequoia as well.
yeah. Yeah, and they, as I mentioned, they were basically big time police. I mean, they were used as police, and that's what they were used as at Yosemite. There was a problem. They had illegal, even though it was set aside as a reserve, as land for preservation purposes. They were having problems with people coming into that land and actually continuing to do activities that were basically not legal. And so that's why they were brought in, basically, is to arrest and stop that illegal activity.
We've got a couple of questions here. How did the standard of living in the West compare to that of those who went to the industrial North? Did the men who went West have better skills and earn more money? And what did the women do?
Now, now I can only speak to the timber industry specifically. And I can tell you that there probably was in my impressions, and it depends on where they landed. It may have been comparable, maybe a little worse, depending. So, for instance, the McNary, which is a company town, I've interviewed a gentleman recently who his family came there from Mississippi. His father arrived first. He secured company housing. They had 4 kids. It was a 2-bedroom house, no running water, no refrigeration, nothing. And this was provided to them by the company. And so people lived in substandard housing. However, if you went to someplace like Flagstaff or went to a community where you could actually either purchase land or build your own place, you certainly had a little more options and more opportunity. You probably had running water, for instance. In Flagstaff, for instance, the area, absolutely, the communities would have been segregated. Black people and Hispanic people basically were relegated to the area south of the tracks in Flagstaff and the community they call the South Side. But they had a lot of things there. They had Elks clubs, they had youth programs, they had schools, they had pickup basketball in parks, they had things that enriched their lives. Yes, they were segregated. Men certainly would have worked at the lumber industries. Women would have either stayed home or they would have worked in restaurants, hotels. They would have been employed as domestics. The gentleman who I interviewed who grew up in McNary, his mother was a cook. She was a well-known cook. She worked at the local hospital there in McNary. She worked at restaurants there. She did domestic work, which is the work that most Black women at the time would have been available to them, not only here but also certainly in the North.
And this is a quick question regarding the south side of Flagstaff. Somebody's asking where the mural is located.
It's off of Benton and I want to say Beaver. And Google it. Google South Side, Google Flagstaff Green Book tour. And I didn't get into it. We had Green Book places in South Side, so they've got a tour that they just developed in Flagstaff around the Green Book. And that mural, they did put it on as part of that tour. They have a pamphlet. If you come to Flagstaff, please do the tour. It's a great walking tour, and you could see the Murdoch Center and all that history that they certainly did. But they did put the mural on it. Dr. Chip Thomas, who it was a medical doctor at Navajo, just retired. He's a photographer and used to do these great community murals and on the reservation. He retired to Flagstaff and he was the one who did that.
Great. One second, I've got a couple more questions here. Somebody else asked about the mural, so that is good info.
He's expanding it, by the way. And by the way, if you happen to know the musician Dom Flemings with the Carolina Chocolate Drops. Dom Flemings is from Arizona. His grandfather helped establish some of the Black churches in the area. And the extension of that mural would include Dom and his family.
Here's another question. Based on your work so far, are there distinct archaeological signatures associated with Black logging camps or other historic archaeological sites? Or is our understanding of this history largely based on other types of information?
And that's a good question. We don't know because nobody's asked the question. Two things to have to remember when it comes to labor and labor camps, and anybody who studies labor camps, most of the material culture that people receive in those camps, because they're all around labor, is provided usually to the laborers. There's commissaries, there's food provided, there's housing provided. So the only way to really distinguish that is by looking at probably material personal items which would have been brought in by the workers. The problem with that is very few things in material culture definitely distinguishes someone as an African American because we're all pretty much shopping at the same stores. One of the things, my newest theory, and I haven't had a chance to look at this, is one of the keys that really distinguishes Black people, and anybody who's Black knows this, is hair products. Hair is a big issue amongst Black people, and there was a cottage industry, a very big, actually, I wouldn't say cottage, big industry around hair products and those types of personal care products that would specifically for marketed to Black people. And my guess is, and I'd love to check, but my guess is that's probably doing that, looking for that with along with oral histories, is probably going to be the way to get at that. But somebody needs to do the work.
This is a twofold question about the Forest Service work in particular. One
Mm-hmm.
person asked, how, as an archaeologist with the Forest Service, did you work with foresters on timber harvest to manage the cultural resources associated with logging camps and other remains? And then simply the other question is the logging industry still active in Arizona?
Mm-hmm.
And how does that compare with the South?
Um, I don't know how it compares with the South because, to be honest with you, I don't know about the Southern logging industry. That's not my area of expertise. I've only read about it and anecdotally. So I do know it's definitely going, and I certainly had family members myself in Oklahoma who were part of that industry, but I can't really speak to that. What I can say is that, yeah, as an archaeologist for the Forest Service, if it walks in the door, we had to deal with it. But in other words, if it's 50 years old and related to human beings, it was ours. And I did work a lot on a lot of usually what we usually talk about. So they don't really call them timber projects. They're really called fuels projects. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with fuels reduction projects that have been going on, major significant amounts of money being poured into fuels reduction due to wildfires here in the West. And I spent the last 20 years doing a significant amount of those projects. A lot of funding has been funneled into the Forest Service out west for this type of work, which includes a variety of different activities to reduce fuels, including logging. They don't necessarily call it logging per se, but certainly that is essentially what it is. And it's done, not clear cut, is done literally to reduce the fuel and to bring these forests back to a manageable amount of trees. It's a long story, but the bottom line is these forests, because of the prevention of wildfire here, and this is a fire ecology, the forests here in northern Arizona are basically denser than they ever were historically. And that has contributed significant to the significant wildfire response that we have here. I would suggest that, and so the work has been over the last 20 years has been to do these significant landscape level fuels reduction projects. Anything that's on Forest Service land has to be addressed for cultural resources. And yeah, we have logging being done near old historic logging camps. Absolutely happen. In fact, in some cases, we have to be careful that they don't take trees out of historic logging camps. We also have significant systems of logging railroads, which are listed on the National Register, and there's hundreds of miles of these systems within the forest now. The tracks were removed, but the berms are still there, and they are very significant archaeologically. So we certainly have to tiptoe around those, but still push towards trying to reduce these fuels because, frankly, these high fuels and this fire danger on these forests also are a major threat to the archaeological resources here. So anything we can do to help them reduce these fuels actually benefits the archaeological resources on national forest land.
Great. Thank you, Margaret. I've got one more question. I don't know how much you know about this or how relevant, but it asks, were Black people among those who were driven out of Bisbee into the desert during the copper mining period? Do
Oh,
you know about
that.
that?
Actually, I do happen to know a little bit about that because I chair the board of directors for the Naco Heritage Alliance, which we're restoring a Buffalo Soldier camp just outside of Bisbee, Arizona. I can tell you that, yeah, there were probably Black people who were a part of the workers. And for those who aren't familiar with this, rather than unionize, one of the copper companies in Bisbee chose to basically expel their workers, and they literally loaded them up on a railroad car and basically dropped them in New Mexico. And
Oh, wow.
I would be willing to bet, I haven't asked that question directly, but there would have been Black people employed in the copper mines in the Bisbee area. So my guess is that yes, there probably were Black people who were a part of that. But the majority of the laborers were probably Hispanic.
Well, we are right at 6 o'clock now, so we've got to wrap up. But we've gotten several comments about how enlightening and informative this has been. A couple of people have shouted out to say hello to you personally, Beth and Randy Porter from Ridgecrest BLM.
Oh,
I've got
oh
some
wow.
comments to share with you after this from them. I'll email it to you.
Please do.
Myra Schwartz Herman from San Diego.
Hmm.
She was having connection problems and said she'd catch up on the lecture afterwards. She just
Okay.
wanted to say hello.
Yeah, and
And
and I
go
was going
ahead.
to say, anybody who has interest in this topic and wants more information, feel free to reach out to me. I'm a proselytizer of this topic because I do think this history is very, very important. And the only way we're going to protect it and learn from it is making sure that people know it's there and care about it.
Definitely. Somebody suggested that we share this presentation with different historical groups, which I think is a great idea. But we'll definitely have it available on our YouTube channel tomorrow. So anybody that's interested can grab the link and share away with anybody that you may know. And just as a closing comment, Jim Egnor says, as a white guy, I stood on that corner in Winslow with Jackson Brown and visited Homolovi,
Malavi.
Homolovi and other sites as a culinary archaeologist. I never truly
Hmm.
knew of African American influence in your area of expertise, and this lecture is amazingly enlightening. And thank you for the education.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Margaret. We really appreciate your time. Thank you, everybody who came and stuck around. And that will conclude us for the evening. So thanks so much, Margaret. And I'll email
Thank
you
you.
transcript and the comments from the questions.
All right. Thank you. Good night,
Thank you so
everyone.
much. Good night.
Thank you for coming.